Man in the elevator. There was a 19-year-old Korean girl named Haruko who was attending university in a large city. One night, she had to stay late in the library to finish a project, and it was almost dark by the time she returned home. Haruko lived on the 14th floor of an old apartment building. She stood in the entrance and pressed the button to call the elevator. She always hated coming home alone so late in the evening. It just didn't feel safe. When the elevator came, she stepped inside and pushed the button for her floor. Just as the doors were about to close, a handsome man came running up. The man was out of breath and put out his hand to stop the doors closing. Then, he stepped into the elevator and stood beside her. "You live on the 14th floor?" he asked, seeing the button lit up. "Yes," replied Haruko. "Oh," said the man, smiling. "I live on the 13th. As the elevator ascended, he pressed the button for 13. Through the windows in the elevator door, Haruko watched the floors go by, as they both stood in silence. She stole a few glances at the man. He certainly was handsome. She wondered if he would ever be interested in dating her. When he happened to look at her, she batted her eyelids and smiled sweetly at him. Just then, the elevator stopped at the 13th floor. The doors opened and the man stepped out. "See you later," he said. "Yes, see you," replied Haruko. As the doors of the elevator were closing behind him, the man suddenly turned around, pulled a sharp knife out of his jacket and said, in a menacing voice, "Upstairs." Then, laughing like a maniac, he ran towards the staircase. The girl was terrified, but before she could do a thing, the doors shut and the elevator began to ascend. She began to panic. Desperately, she hammered the buttons with her fist, trying to get the elevator to stop, but it was no use. When it reached the 14th floor and the doors opened, the man with the knife was already standing there, waiting for her. In Korea, people say that this is a true story. The girl was found dead, stabbed to death in the elevator. People say that the worst part was not her death itself, but rather the sheer horror she experienced in between those two floors, when she was trapped in the elevator and knew she was going to die. They claim that this is the reason that all elevators now have a stop button. Shadows in the station. I live in Tokyo and I take the subway to work every morning. My local subway station is Shinkoiwa Station, on the Chuo line. It is notorious as a place where people commit suicide. It has earned the nickname, Suicide Station. Over the years, countless depressed and misguided people have taken their own lives there by jumping in front of the train. It became such a problem that they installed mirrors in the subway. They say that if the people catch sight of themselves about to jump, it will make them change their minds. I have no idea if it really works. Just last week, there was a suicide at the station. I was there when it happened. I saw the whole thing. It was early in the morning and I was waiting for my train. There were only a few other people on the platform. I heard a voice over the loudspeaker announcing that the train was coming. Just then, I noticed a woman who was standing right in front of me. She was just an ordinary woman, about 26 or 27 years old, but something about her made me nervous. She was acting very strangely. As the train came closer and closer, she stepped forward and began inching towards the edge of the platform. Something was very wrong. She glanced back at me and I could see there was a look of sheer terror on her face. Suddenly, I knew what she was about to do, but I was powerless to stop her. I was frozen to the spot by fear. All I could do was watch as she threw herself in front of the train. There was a screech of brakes as the train tried to stop. The other passengers on the platform screamed. Through the echo of their screams and the metallic screech, I heard a sickening thump. The sight was so grotesque, I couldn't get it out of my mind. There was blood and chunks of flesh flying everywhere. I thought I was going to be sick. The other passengers ran away from the platform and I ran with them. The officials had to close down the whole line. As we waited outside for a bus to take us to our destination, I kept thinking about that poor woman. The scene replayed over and over in my mind, but there was something wrong. Finally, it came on me. The shadows. That's what had made me nervous. I noticed it just before the woman jumped. The lights in the subway were bright, and when they shone down, they cast shadows from left to right. The pillars, the kiosks, everything cast a shadow from left to right. But the woman's shadow had been different. Her shadow went straight forward, stretching from her feet to the edge of the platform, as if a light had been shining from behind her. There was definitely something wrong. I had an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach and it wouldn't go away. I had to get to the bottom of this. As soon as I got to work, I went straight on the internet and began searching for old news stories about the station. There had been almost 20 suicides in the last year alone. Some of them were businessmen, some were housewives, some were old, some were young, and there were even a few children. Then, finally, I found what I was looking for. It was a photograph that had been taken just seconds before a middle-aged man had jumped in front of a train. I zoomed in and examined it very carefully. One of his legs was in the air and he was leaning back. I recognized the same look of terror on his face. There was a black shadow, like an arm, stretching out from under the platform and grabbing the man by the ankle. Suddenly it all made sense. When I saw the young woman in the subway that morning, she wasn't jumping in front of the train. She was being dragged in front of it. I would rather die. In Beijing, China, there were two high school students, a boy and a girl, who really liked each other. They both worked hard at their studies because they wanted to succeed in life. They would always help each other with their homework, and they spent so much time together that they eventually started having feelings for each other. Soon, they became boyfriend and girlfriend. When they graduated, the boy went to Nanjing University and the girl went to Beijing University. They kept in touch and maintained their relationship. They planned to get married when they finished college and have children together. But too much time spent apart can change a person's feelings, and in Beijing, girls are vulnerable to temptation. While the girl was living in Beijing, she met a lot of men. They were more successful, wealthier, wittier and more handsome than her boyfriend. She decided to break up with her boyfriend and stay in Beijing. When she broke the news to her boyfriend that she was dumping him, he went out of his mind. He kept pestering the girl with phone calls until she stopped answering. Then, he traveled all the way to Beijing to see her, but the girl was very unsympathetic. She told him their relationship was over and she had found a new love. She told him to accept the breakup and go home. In a moment of anger and desperation, the boy took a knife and cut his wrist. "I would rather die than lose you," he cried. He had some kind of crazy idea that this would prove to the girl how much he loved her and convince her to take him back. He was very much mistaken. The girl didn't even try to stop him. She didn't even bother to call an ambulance for him. She just stood there and watched as the blood drained from his body. He writhed on the ground in convulsions of pain and agony. Until his dying breath, he stared at the girl, hoping she would agree to take him back. When he was dead, she called the police and they came to take his body away. She didn't even bother to attend his funeral. Shortly afterwards, the girl discovered she was pregnant. 9 months later, she gave birth to a little boy. Before long, she was fed up with being a mother. Taking care of a child was just too much work and it was affecting her social life. When men found out she had a child, they didn't want to date her. Eventually, she decided to give the little boy to her mother so that she could raise him instead. She didn't like her baby much, so it wasn't a difficult decision to make, and she found her life was much more fun without him. However, her mother insisted that she visit the boy 1 weekend per month. One night, the girl drove to her mother's house to visit her son. She only planned to stay there an hour or so and then she would head back to Beijing to spend the evening with her new boyfriend. When she got to her mother's house, she saw the boy sitting in the front garden. She noticed there was something odd about him. When she looked closer, she suddenly realized that he was slicing his wrist with a knife and sucking the blood. The girl freaked out. She ran over and told him to stop. The little boy stared at her intently. That look was familiar. She recognized that stare. Suddenly, the child pounced on her and slit her throat with the knife. "I would rather see you die than lose you," he cried. The puppet. The puppet has always haunted me. It had a big head and its face was made of wrinkled, flesh-colored rubber. The eyes were gigantic, bulging white orbs, and its black hair was made of some hard substance that didn't quite mesh with the rubbery head. The teeth were gigantic, pure white and capable of moving up and down. The body and limbs were wooden, painted to resemble clothes, but the paint was faded. You could see the wood's natural brown in some places. Each arm and leg was a different length, but the hands and feet were pretty detailed. It made a loud clattering sound whenever it moved. The puppet has always followed me. I don't mean it got up and chased me around the room or anything. I mean it kept showing up in my life. My earliest memory of it is from my first birthday. Although I obviously can't recall much of that day, I do remember that horrible puppet. I have no idea why it was there. I just remember it scared me to death and I couldn't stop crying. A few years later, when I was finally able to talk, I asked my parents about it, and they flatly denied anything like that had ever happened on my first birthday. They must have thought lying about it would make things easier for me. The next time I saw it was when I was 3 years of age. I was exploring a room filled with old stuff my parents had stored away and I found a calendar. I don't remember the year. There was a photo for each month, but the only one I remember was October. That puppet was the image for it. I got scared and ran out of the room. I told my mom and tried to show her the calendar so that she'd know the puppet was real, but I couldn't find it. The room had been very messy, and I ran out of it so quickly that I knocked over piles of stuff. I guess the calendar just got buried. It happened again when I was 6 years old. In the middle of the night, I woke up from a nightmare. I was too scared to go back to sleep, so I went down to the living room and turned on the TV. An old black and white TV show was just ending, and when the commercials started, the puppet came on the screen. It was dancing while loud music played in the background. I screamed and started crying uncontrollably, but by the time my parents got downstairs, the puppet was gone. I didn't see the puppet again for quite a while after that, but I kept having nightmares about it. When I was 15, I decided to try to track it down, using the internet to try to find information about the calendar, the commercial, anything. No one had ever heard of it, but one day I got an instant message from someone I had never talked to before. The person's screen name was a random mash-up of numbers and letters, but their avatar was a picture of the puppet. "Glad that you still remember me," they said, then immediately signed off. They never contacted me or came back online again. When I was 20 years old, I was walking past a store that sold old toys and dolls, and in the front window, I saw the puppet. I went inside, and asked the clerk if he knew anything about the puppet's history, when it was made, where it was from, anything. The only thing he could tell me was that the puppet had just been sold to the store a few days before. He told me I could have it for $6. I wasn't sure what to do. It still scared me, but having proof that it really existed seemed like a good idea. So, I bought the puppet and took it home. For a while, I felt better. I regarded the puppet as an irrational childhood fear that, as an adult, I had managed to overcome. I even started to believe the explanations my parents had tried to give me. They said I must have seen it somewhere as a baby and the image just became lodged in my subconscious. I must have imagined it in the calendar, they said. Perhaps I was dreaming when I saw it on the TV commercial. Maybe the person who contacted me online had just been playing a practical joke. I kept the puppet, but as I moved on in my life, I pretty much forgot about it. I finished college, settled down and got married. My wife will be giving birth in a few weeks. I was cleaning up the spare room and preparing it for when the baby comes, when I found the puppet in the back of the wardrobe, dusty and abandoned. I didn't want to leave it in my child's bedroom, so I picked it up and moved it to another place. As I was dusting it off, I noticed a faded inscription on the back. It read, "This is what he will look like." Before I could figure out what this meant, I heard my wife crying downstairs. I rushed to her side and she looked more upset than I had ever seen her before. Sobbing, she told me that the doctor had just called. There was a problem with the baby.